I was a little comforted to hear from several of you that when Rolf first called you to invite you to attend the symposium, that your first reaction was, but I don't work on integrated land use models, because that was exactly my reaction as well. But hopefully there's something here that would be of interest to you. There's certainly been a lot of what's been discussed over these past 3 days that has been of interest to me, so I really appreciate and want to thank you for the invitation. Before I get started with my presentation, which is a pretty much work in progress that Parsons Brinckerhoff with a couple of partners are doing for 2 clients, more or less simultaneously, Atlanta Regional Commission and the Ohio Department of Transportation. I would be very remiss if I did not acknowledge the contributions of the folks that are really doing all the heavy lifting in this project, and in particular, Peter Wowsha, who's been our sort of technical director and whose ideas are pretty much the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. But speaking more specifically about ARC, the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization of the Atlanta region, which is essentially the regional government and the one in charge of planning, not so much land use planning, but transport planning for the region of Atlanta. They do have a set of models that they try to run in an integrated fashion, although that's more of an integration on a sort of a very loosely defined integration, so it's more of a conceptual integration than an actual sort of mechanical integration of models running one after the other. But there's traditionally been 3 models: the REMI, which is a regional economic model, which is they use sort of at the beginning to say, well, what's our economy is going to look like 30 years in the future. So as you know, in the US, they have to do regional plans every 4 years and project 30 years into the future what the region is going to look like. So that's REMI. And then more recently, they've been using PCAS, which is the Doug Hunt's land use model, to essentially take the REMI forecast and allocate it to small zones. For the region of Atlanta, which is 20 counties, it's about 5 million people, I think. The land use zones of PCAS, they're still very aggregate. There's probably 200 to 300 land use zones. But PCAS takes that, and then it does a further disaggregation of those land use zones into the zones that are used by the regional transport model, which is about 6,000 or so. And so traditionally, this has been in Atlanta right now, starting actually earlier this year, in February this year, Atlanta finally adopted the activity-based model as the sort of model of record for the agency. Up to that point, they had been working with a trip-based model, but the activity-based model has been about 10 years sort of under development, and finally now it is, and it was used for the last regional transportation plan, and it's expected to be used for project work from this point forward. This model operates on the network assignment side with a conventional static user equilibrium tool, sort of the usual static assignment. And what we've been working on is actually taking that away and replacing it with dynamic traffic simulation. And so that's what this project has been about. It's essentially making this work, integrating the dynamic simulation model into the activity-based model in something that we'll be talking about is more than just passing information between the 2 models, but actually using the disaggregate nature of the microsimulation to better inform the travel times and the predictions of the activity-based model. So just a couple of very quick notes about the land use side of this entire model. So the overall goal is to have feedback mechanisms between the land use model and the transport model. And so the passing of information that goes on is, is from PCAS to, it's, again, much of this will not be news to you. It's from PCAS to the ABM is PCAS predicts land use disaggregated into about 20 different industrial categories, so essentially jobs. That's what the activity-based model predicts, and into the TAZs. And then it also, some of the information produced by PICAS is also used in synthesizing the population for Atlanta, and in particular, obviously, we need households for the small TAZs, and those households are classified into about 20 to 24 different categories depending on size and income. So those are taken as controls for the synthetic population. The other piece of information that it uses is workers by occupation, and so the intent, again, is to predict the labor force tied to the employment forecast, and so to have some consistency between those two. So that's the intent, and that's sort of what happens. In the reality, though, is what I alluded a little bit to yesterday, is there is a lot of intervention between what PICAS produces and what then gets input into the ABM, because there is a process of consultation with within the agency itself and with the local jurisdictions, because everybody has, the Atlanta region, the MPO has to be, they have to be in agreement, so to speak, with the cities that make up the region as to what they project their land use forecasts are going to be for purposes of developing their regional plan. And so there is a process of consultation and sort of back and forth that takes place. On a more practical side too, so part of what's, again, PICAS was used for the first time for this regional plan, and part of the difficulties that they encounter had to do with the parcel database. It's because takes information from the parcel database, and not surprisingly, because that data is not perfect by any stretch, some of the predictions were confounded by problems in the data, and so some of the work that went on had to do with sort of cleaning all that up and sort of taking some of what PICAS was predicting would happen that was determined that was more an outcome of the bad input data than real reallocation of activities. And then the sort of coming back from the activity-based model to PICAS, then again, it feeds back accessibilities, in this case in the form of, for the work, the activity-based model has a work location choice model. So even though PICAS does its own work allocation of workers to workplaces, the activity-based models also does an allocation of workers to workplaces, and then produces mode choice log sums that get fed back into PICAS, and travel times, and a few other accessibilities. So that's as far as the integration on the land use side is taken. There's some plans to actually build a further feedback loop from PICAS back to the regional economic model, but I don't really know any details of what's in the plans there. So the rest of what I'm going to talk to you now is actually the integration on the other side of the model, which is from the activity-based model to the microsimulation and back. And so why are we doing this? Actually, very simply, and Rick mentioned some of this the other day, is we believe that these models, one of the value added of them is to be able to evaluate a particular type of project or policy that's becoming common in the US, which are managed lanes. And so and in particular, dynamically priced managed lanes. And so there's sort of recognition that further highway capacity in the US is probably going to be added not as free highway capacity, but as priced capacity. And in many cases, what's being proposed is essentially to either convert what are now high occupancy lanes where people with 2 or more passengers are the only ones that can drive on them, convert those to price facilities where now you let people driving on their own pay to use those, or actually to do, in fact, in some cases, even take away a lane from the freeway and dedicate that to pay vehicles. Many of those, the technology now is there for price those facilities in a dynamic fashion. So essentially, what you're selling really is travel time savings because you are driving on a, next to a facility that is not priced but very congested. But that congestion is it's not uniform throughout the day and not even uniform throughout the peak hours. And so it varies. And so depending on the particular conditions when you enter the freeway, it may be worth or not to pay for the toll lanes. And so with a static user equilibrium, where we typically run them for 3 to 4 hours at a time, this type of policy sort of gets more or less lost in the results. So that's the that really has been the main motivation. And then there's sort of some add-ons to that, which are, for example, the activity-based models use relatively refined representation of time. In the case of Atlanta, it's half an hour. The other work that we're doing is every 15 minutes. But again, the simulation is still the travel times that are used to make the demand predictions are still based on 3-hour-long or 4-hour-long averages. So there was sort of a desire to make that a little more consistent. And then the second one, which is both sort of a statement of, I guess, the limitations of the activity-based models that we've developed, but also, and again, related to the quality of the travel time information that we get, is that we know that sometimes the travel plans that the demand models estimate are actually not really feasible in time or space. And so that, in fact, we do have situations where we have people departing from a location before they actually arrived, for example. And so, so again, a desire to correct that with the belief, perhaps, and we haven't really proven this, but I think sort of conceptually it makes sense, is that when you get rid of those types of inconsistencies, the elasticity or the way in which the forecast reacts to changes in level of service make more sense. I mean, that you don't have people going really early to work or staying at work really late, sorts of results that we see sometimes when you just kind of let the model do its own thing. So a lot of information in that chart, but there's basically two main components here. So at the very top, you see the ABM, so that's what we call the core demand model, so that's the one that predicts activities. Well, in the case of Atlanta, it doesn't really predict activities, but tours and trips and modes and destinations. And then right here is where would have been the traffic assignment, so that's we've replaced with a DTA package that's called Dynasty. And then to connect the two of them, then we've built in an integration layer here that we call it ISAM, so Individual Schedule Adjustment Model, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the rest of it is mostly just sort of showing you the data transfer between these various pieces. This part here, the transit microsimulation, we put it aside. I think it was sort of part of the original proposal, but recognize that, both in terms of the funding that was made available and the time that was made available and the sort of the complications associated with trying to make this work, that was something that maybe we were better off not thinking about. So for now, the schedule adjustments and all that just happen for people that drive, but not for people that use transit. We still use conventional aggregate transit schemes. So in this chart, there's really, so in the conventional scheme of things, we have to achieve a travel time equilibrium. We have essentially one feedback loop, right? So we go from the demand model to the simulation and back, and we keep doing that, 3, 4, or 5 times until the travel times converge, and then we say, okay, now we have equilibrium, and then we're done. In this particular case, there's actually potentially 3. There's still that feedback loop, but then now we have within, we have a step here where we do this schedule consolidation, and then there's the bigger loop again, where we feed back the travel times to the ABM. And now this feeding back is no longer in terms of aggregate schemes, zone-to-zone schemes, but it's more in terms of actually mining vehicle trajectories and obtaining travel times for individual trips from the microsimulation. So that first loop is actually conceptually very simple, but it's essentially sort of based on sort of recognizing that when you do an assignment, right, and where you're assigning individual vehicle trips, or even in an aggregate sense, we typically then we take the assigned, the loaded network, and we skim travel times from origins to destinations, which are, these special nodes in the network. And in doing that, we lose a lot of information because in going from one origin to one destination, in fact, you traverse a portion of the network where you're visiting multiple nodes, and so that actually you could extract information about the travel time that it takes to go not just from your origin to your final destination, but also to intermediate steps along the way. And so rather than just skim travel times from origins to destination, then what we're doing is out of the microsimulation, we write down the vehicle sub-trajectories and then mine the data bank of levels of service. And that's really all there is to it. Sort of conceptually, it's very simple. In sort of practical terms, you're dealing with a very large data bank of vehicle trajectories, and so a lot of the work that has been gone into this is sort of how to handle that big file or that big data bank efficiently, and how to mine it efficiently. So one of the things that we spend time thinking about then is how do you write that file out, and again, so at the end of the day, we write it in terms of sub-trajectory, so not the software original was just writing the main trajectory, but now it writes in terms of all the origins, and so all the possible nodes. And again, maybe step back. So Dynasty, this particular software that we're using, loads trips not just at the TAZs, TAZ centroids, but it actually loads trips on different nodes along the way. And so we can write down the vehicle trajectories in that way. And once we have that the data bank of sub-trajectories, then the idea is then to compute what's the travel time for a particular trip interchange or trip in the ABM. So when we go to evaluate our destination and mode choice models, and we need to know, well, what's the travel time for this particular trip or this particular person from A to B, then we go to this file and we mine it, and essentially we do a search. And so it may be that we find that, and again, since now this is all microsimulated, then the people in the demand model, we know, who they are in the microsimulation. I mean, we could know, but when we go to do that search, then it may be that you find a perfect match. So you do find it, you find your origin to your destination at the departure time at which you want that trip, right? And again, keep in mind that what we're trying to do here is to add that temporal dimension. So you need to find it at, is it the departure time, this 15-minute departure time, or the next 15-minute departure time, or the next one, and so forth. And so if we find it perfect, and we move on. If we don't find it, then that's where we do a search with relaxations. So we start relaxing the criteria that we're using to say we have a match. And this particular set of criteria is what we're using for MORPC, and that was a little bit of an easier case than Atlanta, because in the MORPC region, for now, there are no toll facilities. So really, essentially the relaxation that takes place here is first in terms of time. So the simulation happens every 5 minutes, but so if we don't find it within that 5-minute interval, that is the departure time for the trip that we're trying to find a scheme for, then we relax it to 15 minutes. If we don't find it for 15 minutes, then to 60 minutes. And then there's at the spatial level as well. So the MORPC model uses 2 levels of spatial aggregation. The conventional TAZs, traffic analysis zones, but there's a much smaller zone system that we call microanalysis zones. And so if we do the search first for the microanalysis zones at the microanalysis zone level, if it doesn't find it, then we move 1 step up to the TAZs. Up to when we get to this point where by the time we're looking for a vehicle trajectory that's for at the TAZ level and at the 1 hour or 2 hour level, then essentially what we're doing is no better than having skimmed the network from conventional static equilibrium, where really the only advantage that we would have here from doing all of this is if we actually believe that the DTA, even at this aggregate level, is giving us better travel times than static user equilibrium. In the case of ARC, and we haven't reached this point yet with ARC, but should be there sometime between the next 7 weeks, because that's when our project's supposed to end. We add 2 search criteria. So one of them is value of time. So again, remember, as I mentioned, the main motivation what we're doing this in Atlanta is because they have 1 managed lane facility and plans for many more. And so we do want to search, when we search for a representative travel time or levels of service, then we want to do it add value of time as part of that criteria. When thinking that someone with high value of time would not necessarily choose the same path as someone with a low value of time. And so the values of time in the ABM is a distribution. It's not just a simple segmentation, it's a distribution. Now, for purposes of the search, we do split it into 4 or 5 bins. And again, we haven't really done this, so we don't know exactly what we're gonna come out there, but that's the idea. The other search criteria is going to be vehicle occupancy, because again, the managed lanes, the restrictions for who has or doesn't have access to the managed lane or who pays or doesn't pay have to do with vehicle occupancy. So then again, we need to know, are we searching for level of service for a 2-person car, or are we searching for level of service for a 1-person car? And so those 2 criteria are going to make the search more difficult. On the plus side for us, ARC uses a much more aggregate zone system, and so the hope is that because of that, then it'll be easier to find a match. So again, for Columbus, so what's been our success so far in terms of finding a trajectory in the data bank? So depending on, again, the relaxation criteria, up to this point, is where we're saying, well, you're better off with the DTA, and that's about 80% or so. 4 is where we say, well, again, these trips, we're doing no better than the static equilibrium. And about 10%, we couldn't find a match. So basically when we search, or essentially means we couldn't find a match within a relaxation criteria that we felt was appropriate, that to go beyond that is essentially you're more or less just guessing at what the level of service is. So that means that, potentially when we do the simulation, we're going to have some trips for which we don't have levels of service. And then, so what do you do with those? We could still use schemes, just conventional schemes. We could just take the loaded network, and for those trips, just a scheme. Do sort of what we'll call a 0 iteration assignment, right, and just find a level of service for those particular trips. Just for expediency purposes, and now we'll probably just use this, although obviously that adds travel time, because it means on top of having to do all the simulation, now we still have to skim the network at the very end, but okay, that at least helps us keep going. We could apply further aggregation, but there's some danger there, again, in which we may end up with levels of service that don't make any sense. There is a thought as well of accumulating trajectories for multiple iterations of the model. So again, this is a feedback process, so we run it multiple times. And then each time, rather than simply replace all the trajectories, we could just keep adding to the bank. But again, you could end up in a situation where you could end up with some unreasonable results, because again, the idea is as you resimulate the network, you will get a different equilibrium condition, and so is it really appropriate to take travel times from a previous equilibrium condition and use them in some other ones. So partly for that reason, for now, we do keep track when we add trajectories to the bank of which iteration produced those trajectories, so that at least we apply that in our searching criteria, right? The preference is always choose from the most recent one, but if we can't find one, then we might go a step back. So that's that internal loop, essentially. So that's how we plan on replacing the conventional schemes with information coming from vehicle trajectories. Now, the second part is the schedule adjustment. And again, in a sort of, again, very, very straightforward, simple concept, but one that we don't always respect in our models is that when you're assigning a list of trips to the network, well, those trips are not individual, they're not independent of each other. And so you should be careful that when you're assigning the trips for a particular person, that you don't have that person leaving from a destination before they actually arrive there. And as simple as it sounds, we actually don't do that. We happily just let them, let the assignment go. And then the same concept applied in the demand model, which is, again, is that we produce travel plans or travel schedules. So by that I mean, so for a complete trip chain is when people are leaving for all the destinations they're visiting in the chain, and then make sure that we don't have inconsistencies, that again, that we don't say they left before they actually arrived at that destination. And that can happen again, perhaps because our models are perhaps too naive in that they're basing that prediction on previous travel times, but it might be that when we go and assign them, the travel time is actually much longer, and so that what seemed a feasible choice is no longer feasible given the most current simulation of travel times. And so these charts, it just really shows that situation in which, for example, we have a set of feasible trips in which everyone arrives. There's some time spent at the destination, and then they go on, and the time in which the model says that they would leave from each destination is consistent with them having arrived there and having spent some reasonable amount of time given whatever the activity they were doing there. But we do have many situations in our model where, in fact, that doesn't happen, that gets violated, and so it can happen that they arrived after we had planned that they were going to leave. Now, in our list of trips, they are still leaving at this time, but so that, we can go ahead and assign that and get a number out of it. But the idea, again, is that getting rid of these inconsistencies will make the overall model behave better when we actually go and test how we're going to change the tolls over time, for example. And so this is really just sort of, again, it's explaining the same concept. So we do when we do the individual schedule adjustment, basically the trip-based model sort of predicts both the arrival time, the departure time from each location, the arrival time, and the duration of the activity at that location. Okay. And so what we do there is essentially we've simulate the departure time, so we adjust them. That's just really just that same idea. And so, well, essentially so that simulation, what it's doing is just simply an application of that concept of schedule delay, where we say, well, so there's a planned arrival time or a planned departure time, that's what we get from the model, and now we're going to adjust it. And we adjust it either we can move it a little bit early or a little bit late, and use some sort of penalty function to say, well, how onerous is to move this time early or late, depending on the activity and so forth. And so a lot of that information has come from stated preference surveys, some previous studies that folks have done. And let me just jump here really quickly to the very end. So how do we know that this is working? And it is converging, so we've came up with these measures of convergence of this schedule adjustment. One is we keep track of how many people have infeasible schedules. we keep track of how many people are stressed, and by stress, what we mean is they have a travel time that is much too long given the time that they're already spending out of home. So for example, if you're only spending an hour doing out-of-home activities, but your travel time is 3 hours, then we might say, well, no, that it's probably that is not a good solution, and so we flag that as a stress person. And then we keep track of, from simulation to simulation of just the schedule adjustment is how much are we changing the departure times of every one person, and so we want to get to the point in which they don't change by more than 5 minutes, and so that's what sort of we call that it's, they've reached convergence. And then I just want to show you some examples, and I apologize, realized looking at this yesterday, the axis is off by 1 unit. These are tests that we did with the MORPC network, and what they show, so in terms of those R measures of convergences, so at the very beginning, you see a lot of change, a lot of people that have inconsistent schedules, and then very quickly that goes down, but it doesn't go down to 0. It goes down to about 10%. And so through this simulation of just, again, remember in this case, we're freezing the destinations, we're freezing the number of trips, and the only thing we're changing is the departure time. So that's about as good as it gets. Same in terms of unstable schedule, so a lot of change at the beginning, and then very quickly reaches this situation where, again, we're sort of, just somewhat below 10% of the population that have unstable schedules. And in terms of stress households, that's the one where we actually don't see much of a change. The number of stress households in the simulation stays about the same, regardless of how many times we run our schedule adjustment. And so, and again, so this is where we are right now. Our hope is that then when we implement the main loop and we take these households and resimulate all their travel choices, that now this will decrease. That's the hope. We'll see if it happens. But in terms of our interim conclusions, basically we do see this procedure working, and so that's, we're happy about that. But again, still some work to be done as far as making sure that this whole concept works in practice. A few other things, which again, we've sort of come to realize as we've been doing this work is that, some of the difficulties, for example, that we're seeing in our trying to reach consistency with schedules might simply be that our models are too naive, and so that, in fact, perhaps we could do more to make the model smarter about, for example, in the case of destination choice, the way in which we create a choice set for the destination choice model is almost completely devoid of information about how far can this person really go given what their complete activity schedule is like. And part of that is because our ABM, our first version of the ABM, didn't know all the activities when it was making the choice decision for primary destinations. Now the new version of the ABM does know that, and so there's some hope then that some of this sort of process of adjusting schedules can converge more quickly if we make our models smarter from the get-go. I think this one here right at the very end is more sort of a cautionary note to self than a lesson learned, and that is in this whole scheme there are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of steps where we say we're not going to resimulate everybody, we're going only to resimulate the ones that have infeasible schedules. And when we do that, I think, at least in my mind, it sort of raises the question of what type of solution are we reaching at the very end? And is that a solution that we can claim in some way is equilibrium or optimal in some fashion? And that is important for the reasons that David was alluding to. At the very end of the day, we want to use this model to test alternatives. And oftentimes those alternatives don't really make a very huge impact on the network as a whole. And so if the solution that we get is very dependent on the path that we use to arrive there. Can we really say with confidence that, in fact, when we apply all of this and we see differences, that those differences are due to the project and not to the way in which we did the simulation? And so that, I think, for me, is still something that we still have a lot of analysis to do and convince ourselves that, in fact, it works. I would say up to this point, we really have been working more on the mechanics of how do we make this work. And now that the tool is nearly ready, then hopefully have some time of testing it and doing some sensitivity tests. All right, that's it.
Thank you, Rosella. That's a huge project. Very, very exciting what you're doing.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask one question about the first feedback loop you were talking about, because I saw some parallels to the work that I'm pursuing, because you feed microscopic travel times back to the ABM model. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to feed back microscopic travel times to the land use model. And so the comment refers to both your research as my research. It made me wonder whether we give agents information that is too perfect, actually. Mm-hmm. Right? So the skim matrix averages out a little bit how much it actually takes, but now people know exactly how long it takes, and then they can go back and readjust their day. Yeah. Is there this risk that we are making it too perfect?
I think there is, and I wonder sometimes as well is the time scale, right? And so in this particular case, so if we're trying to come up with a toll scheme for a managed lane in which we're trying to tell the client, yes, it makes sense to charge, $4 and $10 and then $6 sort of every 15 minutes, or some sort of function that varies with time. They're really at that level. All we really need to know is sort of what are the it's really just a root choice problem in my mind. And so all the added extra baggage that we put into the model, which is the feedback to the mode choice and the feedback to the destination choice models. Those are all second order effects, right? And perhaps we'd be better off if, when we make this model, test those alternatives, if we fixed all of that and not worry about that. But if you're thinking about, well, how does this impact land use decisions that are much longer term, then I wonder, do I really need to know that the travel time in this facility changes with this profile every 15 minutes? Maybe it's just good enough to know that, it's, changes, on an hourly or even longer basis on a certain profile. So I think part of the issue that we have to deal with when we put together these models is that they're meant to be used for everything. And so sometimes they're not really all, that well geared to any one particular use. And we struggle with that a little bit.
Thanks. Very interesting work. And I was struck, maybe I didn't understand all the details, but it looked very much that you're re-implementing MATSIM.
What?
You're re-implementing the core ideas behind MATSIM at, I don't know, what expense. So I was wondering, and given that we had some interaction with Peter Wolfscher in the past, why did you decide to go down that route of implementing it yourself? Was there a particular strategic reason to do that?
I don't know, quite frankly. Why he chose this particular implementation and not something else, I couldn't tell you. Okay. Part of it might be simply it was sort of what was available to us at the time, although, and again, MATSIM is available. So I couldn't answer that question for you. Okay. So.
And I think coming back to this question of over-optimization, yes, that happens. So if you really want realistic levels of congestion, at some point you have to add error back into the system.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can you go back to the stressed households?
To the,
The slide on the stressed households? I think it was the previous slide. Okay, no. That one. So you say that you're worried that the model might be a little bit naive with respect to trip location, and that's why you have this persistence of stress. But aren't you, when you're doing your replanning, looking at different destinations?
not here. So this chart, what it's showing you is just running the second loop. So essentially the ABM runs and produces a list of trips with destination modes and initial, and a plan, what we call a plan, travel time, departure times. And then we feed that trips list into Dynasty that comes out with the vehicle trajectories. And then we feed that information from the vehicle trajectories only into the schedule assignment module, but not at this level, not yet back to the ABM. And so what you're seeing here is multiple iteration of just ISAM. And so where essentially it's just readjusting schedules, but it's keeping the modes and the destinations fixed.
And so if you were to not keep the destination fixed, what do you think would happen to those graphs?
I think they would dip, and I guess that's what we're about to test. And so the idea, well, the thinking was, and I guess still is, and we just haven't had a chance to try it in different ways, is that we could, for example, run the model as a one huge loop, and that essentially would take so we go from the ABN to the vehicle trajectories and back to the ABM and to the vehicle trajectories and back. But that, just because of the time that it takes to resimulate everybody, would take longer than if we actually tried to adjust the schedules as an intermediate step. Now that for now is just a hunch. We haven't actually tried this, but we could. I mean, once all the pieces are working together, we could try that. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Rosella. This was
You're welcome.
exciting.